In 2007, music journalist Andrew Harrison coined the term landfill indie in order to describe a swath of predominantly English indie rock acts who broke out in the mid-2000s. For acts that broke out just after the decline of Britpop and in the wake of early 2000s garage rock and post-punk revival. It was a genre term that caught on amongst the blogs of that era, less because the music was incompetent or even bad in its own right and context, but because it was formulaic, increasingly stale, hard jangling guitars and nervy grooves, presumed to be more style than substance, with more critique directed at a specific, easily marketed aesthetic and an assumption of pretentiousness in the songwriting and lyrics than, the actual sound. And over 20 years later, as someone who actually lived through this era, I've got a couple observations. The first being that, like most broad, pejorative genre labels, I remember R&B that came out just a couple years later, it's a pretty surface level, even somewhat inaccurate diagnosis of the bands that made this landfill indie, especially for the biggest acts at the top like the Wombats, the Kooks, the Fratellis, even the Arctic Monkeys. Yeah, they got swept up in that label too. In some online spaces, you could argue it even happened retroactively to the Strokes. And they're not even from the UK. And sure, a bunch of lesser-known mid-card acts that you've already forgotten in this trend, they might have a similar sound or a vibe. They might not have been making challenging indie rock music, but hey, welcome to the reality of every bubbling up scene and popular fad. There can be a certain uniformity, even in the creative arts, when everybody's trying to get on board, especially when there's a desire to chase one specific sound. And B, it's not like that more critically respected scene didn't have a presence in the mid to late 2000s, or that they weren't getting acclaim or even commercial placements. This was indeed the blog era, where the right pitchfork review could make or break a band. And while those writers largely had a marked contempt for landfill indie at the time, if they even bothered to cover it, you look sideways at many of the acts they praised in that era, they weren't that far afield. They'd at least play on the same festival, if not on a similar stage. The ironic thing is that Andrew Harrison coined the landfill indie term in passing, in a positive review of Jens Lenkman's 2007 album Night Falls over Corditala, that embraced more intricate Baroque pop flourishes in contrast to the wiry, perceived as more basic indie rock of that era, where you get the odd impression that many of the critics at that time dumped on landfill indie because the dance-leaning, pop-adjacent material that they were more in favor of at that time was perceived as closer to the cutting edge, and it wasn't getting the same attention, be it from fans or larger outlets. At least until those critics themselves became tastemakers, broke a whole bunch of those pop-leaning acts through a couple of years later, and a fair few of the landfill indie acts wound up making their own pop pivots in the years to come, in varying success. Now, this conversation could go in any number of different directions, the first being the most tired relitigation of poptimism versus rockism, plumbing into the historical biases of music critics from the era of Tony Blair, with all the associated denigration of the writers and fans that propagated a lot of that discourse. And while that could be very funny for some very niche music nerds of 20 years ago, or people with a grudge, there's a different angle in history that I want to untangle here, because the other side to landfill indie was that it was a scene that got major spend from more mainstream publications to breathlessly promote as the next big thing, where every other week on the cover of NME there was a new act that you had to know as a new savior of rock music, and the 2000s were not really kind of rock of any stripe on both sides of the Atlantic. It felt like a desperate scream against some of the tide. It also seemed like there was a subset of record labels, many of whom weren't exactly that indie, and by extension the music publications that were fighting tooth and nail to keep a specific image of a rock star, viable and popular, when the scene was evolving in a very different direction. And before you think I'm just picking on a lot of landfill indie acts here and the labels that bankrolled them, I watched the glut of post-grunge, the scene in emo boom, and the bright sheen of accessible pop rock that leaned towards dance punk in the 2000s, then be followed by 2010's bro country, trashcore, and perhaps most relevantly, indie commercial core that often felt like the natural outgrowth of where that 2000s landfill indie was rooted, much of which received a lot of the same derisive critical response. Unfairly or not, sometimes those acts were praised by critics just years earlier. Now again, the scene was not critically respected in their era. Easy silent majority targets, who also happened to sell a lot of records, get big commercial placement by advertising executives in an era where that success and money was increasingly hard to come by. I'm not the sort of person who believes that quality ultimately wins out when it comes to music popularity and wider spread. There's way too much label nonsense and trend chasing, promotional quirks, and sheer dumb luck for that to be the case. But there was an audience for landfill indie that wasn't just the common pleb who saw the right mid-roll or TV commercial. If you went digging, there was some quality there. And there's even a modest landfill indie reappraisal happening right now. They're in a nostalgia cycle where the critics in times past may have missed more than they want to admit. And I bring all this up because if we look at the UK indie scene in the 2020s, it's happening all over again. Yeah, it's a long delayed intro. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture, where this is not a review, but we gotta talk about landfill post-punk, cowardice, and specifically, dry cleaning. So, I didn't review Dry Cleaning's critically acclaimed 2021 album, New Long Leg, mostly because I didn't really care for it at the time and I had no shortage of other reviews that I wanted to make. The sharp, desaturated timbre, the guitars with traces of smoked out Britpop delay, the stalking heavy bass grooves, the weirdly underwhelming drums, this was all familiar, generally likable if you've been listening to post-punk from the late 70s onwards, but it was notably anchored by the front woman Florence Shaw and her flattened, deadpan observations about post-Brexit United Kingdom, where the lyrics seemed almost a little abstract, borderline nonsensical, but tended to coalesce around a lot of workaday observations and an undercurrent of malaise, half of which felt systemic, half of which felt deeper and more emotive, but she can never fully reveal it for any given reason. Some of that might be fear, some of it might be cowardice, some of it might be secretive or embarrassment, some of it cultural restraint to not make a fuss, because if you do, there's skin in the game. It could go very wrong for you, make you uncomfortable, and no, we don't want that now, do we? Now, if I wanted to be really mean, I would describe Dry Cleaning as music that your cool friends who want to sound smart enjoy, but there is something to how Florence Shaw's flat, eye-rolling disavowal with just enough ironic deflection that you could say that it's about bigger things, but you might not get it the first time, and that's why it's cool, If you remember how a lot of grunge bands got away with the lyrics like this in the 90s, this should be very familiar. You've seen this happen before in music throughout decades past. But thus, calling it innovative, or the new cutting edge, especially if you've been on Bandcamp at all and heard the formula repeated dozens, if not hundreds of times over, or something that would be essential to hear in 2021? Truthfully, once you've contextualized the monotone presentation and key into what Florence Shaw is exploring, you come to realize that, at least on that debut album, she and her band are playing into a very traditional framework of post-punk, where the vast majority of her lyrical references, they could be translated to decades past and they would not feel that amiss. And just to establish some of that framework for all of my audience who weren't, well, alive in decades past during Thatcher or Reagan, aka the vast majority of you, the first wave of punk music in the mid-70s was rooted in deconstruction. We're taking the very simple and shiny chords of the early rock and roll in the 50s and adding more meat and gristle and distortion, tap into a darker undercurrent or underbelly that was kind of always there, especially compared to the more classically influenced grandiosity of progressive rock or stadium rock of that time. Now, post-punk was the next stage of that postmodern deconstruction, often with analogous politics, although not always, but pushing the sound considered more basic in punk into more artistically challenging directions. Now, this is a greatly simplified history. There's a lot of overlap between the scenes and all manner of weird idiosyncrasies and swerves where regionalism between the UK and US and other nations worldwide absolutely matters. But that was also about 4 or 5 decades ago. This is history. What was once considered deconstructive and challenging has not only been revived once before in the 2000s, but now it's back again in the 2020s. Although one could argue the breadth of post-punk they're drawing upon this time has improved compared to the more limited, nervy strains of the 2000s. Shame, Fontaine's DC, Sports Team, Yard Act. You could probably make a considerable argument for multiple bands in what's now being called the whole windmill scene, like Squid, Black Midi, Black Country New Road, Maruja. And while this is not UK specific, in Canada we had Aught and Viet Cong, later calling themselves Preoccupations. You could probably slot in women there as well. In the United States there was Protomartyr, Parquet Quartz. There is a slight difference between the post-punk of the 2010s that was more underground, which in the UK included acts like Fat White Family, Savages, Sleaford Mods, and who got a lot of critical acclaim, but rarely ever crossover popularity, and the UK post-punk of the 2020s, which has actually had some charting hits, some sales success. And it's also not just that. Similar to what was branded as Landfill indie in the 2000s, there seems to be a prevalence of 2020s post-punk that's been getting similar waves of popular hype by similar labels and similar publications, with a more entrenched UK radio market getting them play, where I've heard the derisive landfill post-punk term in response to that scene. And it might seem to be applicable. I mean, a very familiar sound, not really innovating that much on an increasingly older formula, with a lyrical pretentiousness that doesn't seem to add up to more on closer examination, seemingly terrified to take a risk, really challenge the audience, but getting framed as the hot new thing you need to care about, and just maybe showcasing a little bit more quality beneath the surface. I mean, all the parallels are there, and yet, it seems like more critics are on board this time around, more willing to give more of them a chance, fairly or not. At least at first. We'll come back to that caveat, but if you've been looking at year-end acclaim, a lot of landfill indie acts rarely got it in the 2000s. A popular subgenre and sound, it tended to get widely snubbed unless there was precisely 1 or 2 bands that everybody felt okay with endorsing. The token landfill indie act. But landfill post-punk is all over those year-end lists. Dry Cleaning with New Long Leg in 2021, despite the fact you could draw a lot of parallels to landfill indie bands, at least in theory. And I don't just think it's because we all got apparently smarter or more enlightened in the last 20 years. Especially as a longtime country fan, I've seen how critics behave toward genres or acts or trends that they think they're above with increasingly bad or lazy excuses. So I gotta wonder, is it political? The answer to that's kind of murky. Like punk music before it, post-punk trends towards left-leaning ideologies, but is by no means consistent. And part of that is built into the deconstructive, postmodern nature of the genre. Quick derailing tangent I need to get off my chest here. It's been a constant fallacy among the less politically literate, the conflation of postmodernism and Marxism or socialism, when in reality they operate in similar but occasionally conflicting spaces. Both propose a challenge to the modern status quo, but postmodernism can be just as deconstructive to left-wing modernist ideology, like Marxism as well. Now, this is where we can open up the larger tangle of dialectics and how the process of revolution is to be iterative and progressive, where then you could argue that postmodernism should play a role in that dialectic framework, where some postmodernists would actually argue that it's a framework itself that needs to be deconstructed in some lane, who built the dialectic, who controls it, and why. But let's be real. The reality is that neither movement has a tangible power base outside of certain universities in the Western world compared to capitalist hegemony, which dominates our lives. So they wind up getting bucketed together and then conflated as one and the same, even if there are marked differences between them. I blame Jordan Peterson's rantings about postmodern neo-Marxism for some of that conflation, and also a whole bunch of other things that aren't relevant here. And a great example of a lot of this discussion and tension comes in the music. I'm gonna leverage my 3 Ps of great political art. Punk's often direct, fiery, leveraging a lot of power and populism, but perhaps not always as precise. Whereas post-punk can often be way more precise, especially in language, but might sacrifice both power and populism in a more art school abstracted frame. And given that critics, on average, tend to come from more of that art school background, they tend to identify and like a lot more post-punk that can camouflage some of its politics than them be more direct and abrasive, but possibly simplified within punk. Well, you have to engage more directly with what punks are saying in challenging that system, and when that carries a certain amount of risk in an increasingly authoritarian political environment, until you get the retrospectives decades later and the seminal punk albums somehow always wind up back on those lists, when maybe some of the post-punk acts of the moment might fade away. Curious, very curious. And a band I largely sidestepped in some of this conversation before now is Idols, who often became the token punk act discussed by some of these publications at the time, when there was just as large and loud of a contingent of critics who thought that they were cringe and stupid, kind of revealing, especially given what they were writing about in those first couple of albums. But then Idols swerved making post-punk, which was considered a lot more intellectual and sophisticated, and was also nowhere near as good, fairly or not. So chalk that up to the whole genre tag of landfill post-punk, I guess. But let's circle back to Dry Cleaning, finally, and that critically adored debut album. To give this band a lot of credit, probably more than they deserve, there is some pretty pointed structural critiques on that album in the malaise of late capitalism, post-Brexit England, along with some pretty stark feminist critique about how women exist in that grinding space. One of my favorite songs on New Long Leg is More Big Birds, from the point of view of a housewife who's actually trapped in that soul-sucking, seemingly mindless drudgery of maintaining the home, where she dreams of getting a Kalashnikov rifle, and that can read as a very stark, revolutionary moment on the tight ship of running the nuclear family, but even then it ultimately feels like a deflection. A glam musical. It's not really gonna go there, even if Shaw's deadpan is pretty damn effective in selling some of that tension. I mean, the political ideas are there. I'll give Dry Cleaning that. But there's always that disavowal waiting, either through lyrical abstraction or Shaw's delivery being considered sarcastic or ironic. A critique of power, but not really challenging it that much, which has you wondering across the album whether she thinks she can challenge power. Some of this might be cultural. The ossified but still pronounced English class system would intensify a hierarchical mindset, where with the collapse of class mobility in North America, it's not hard to see a similar frame over here. And, she's far from alone in possibly feeling this. The scary thing about being a postmodernist aware of how systems broadly affect and shape our lives and wanting to question it is that for as much deconstruction as you can bring to bear, how much of it is actually capable of changing things without raw power behind you, where you're all the more acutely aware of how power can be abused, so you wind up disavowing the power and nothing winds up changing, or it just gets worse. Or the power gets co-opted, and you wind up making money, but the message gets lost along the way when you're making the art, because it's easier than confronting the enormity of it all. It's why some punks in the late 70s and early 80s didn't really respect or trust post-punk that much, because it was abstracted, diffuse, seemingly catered to more educated or wealthy tastes rather than challenging the system, supporting the working class, especially when the genre cross-pollinated with new wave and left even more politics and sophistication behind to play the pop games. Although, if we're keeping it real, punk often went pop just as much, from the constructed origin at the music industry and all across the many waves in the decades to follow. Punk's not getting off that easy. But truthfully, I'm not sure that's a satisfying or even complete answer as to why critics have embraced landfill post-punk in this lane a lot more than landfill indie. It comes more with the disavowal itself, the shield of irony or deflection, the sense, the aesthetic of cool. It can feel more cutting edge and abrasive on the surface while deferring to the classics. It can feel smarter, even if it might not be. It's not just playing the easy hits game, chasing the classic archetype. I mean, it still is a classic archetype with decades of history, but it's a better archetype. Certainly not one that the masses would easily embrace. You can hold your taste a little higher. Now, I should also mention at this point, some of this is not a new observation what I'm making. In early January 2022, Fergal Kinney, writing for Cowardice, effectively took Yard Act to the cleaners for their debut, with a lot of analogous but cutting observations. Familiar textures with a built-in nostalgic audience, especially in the UK. Gestures at higher themes, but with enough flattened disavowal to avoid taking a more charged stand, one that feels distinctly out of time as well, which is another observation that can feel just as accurate with Dry Cleaning's lyrics, with a specific focus on Sprechgesang, which translates as spoken singing, where, of course, parallel to Dry Cleaning and Florence Shaw, especially the heavy influence, in particular, of Mark E. Smith of the band The Fall, in comparison with other post-punk legends. Although Mark E. Smith's politics were notoriously messier, especially as he got older, with a marked contempt for high-minded fans. The piece is excellent. It's linked below, and there are several parallels between it and this piece here. While I will agree with the broader assessments of why the music industry has been desperate to propel these acts to popularity, I'd argue many critics were kind of left off the hook for their role. I'm not about to be so generous. I've talked about some of this before in my video essay on Justin Timberlake and Cool, but let's throw another flaming hot take on the pile. A lot of mainstream critics want to less analyze art, get into the thorny weeds of culture and philosophy, than to be the tastemakers and help define what's considered cool, especially if it can conceivably split the difference with some of their own nerdier music taste. That will build a lot of social capital, which then can be translated into actual direct capital by music publications that employ them and rely on label advertising and connections for interviews, and they also want to be seen as arbiters of cool in order to build up an audience however they can. And I'm not even saying they're wrong for that. If you find something cool or interesting and you want to share it, or then condemn something that you think is sucks or uncool, well, sometimes the rationale gets written post hoc to just dress it up. It's why so many critics can be so confused or bitter when they see a scene with mass popularity, especially if it winds up being considered cool, that they may have missed when it was on the come up, or they don't get it, especially when that cool relies on something ephemeral, in person, or at least offline, or if what they choose to be considered cool winds up getting widely ignored or despised. I mean, I've mentioned previously the Fluke Indie Act that notches a lot of critical acclaim for precisely one project that might not be all that different from what they've released in the past. Probably would have deserved more attention for that, but it also seems to capture the zeitgeist in a moment out of nowhere, and it doesn't last. And I gotta wonder how often that follow-up getting tossed aside or ignored, even if it's doing a lot of the same thing, comes from frustrated critics or audiences or publications that wanted something to be more than just a moment. So on that note, let's talk about Dry Cleaning's sophomore album. I'm not too proud to admit that after I was initially unmoved by New Long Leg, I skipped Stumpwork outright in October 2022. The reviews were cooler as the band sought to diversify their sound with slower and more deliberate compositions, softening some of their jangling edges in the way that so many other post-punks did before them, extending their shelf life. When, if the criticisms didn't circle more of the same with diminishing returns. There could also be a reticence to delve deeper into Shaw's writing, which felt even more abstracted, where amidst a lot of her dubious singing, the monotone was becoming monotonous. And yeah, I'm not too proud to admit that the album art, it just kind of grossed me out. It's the pettiest thing to raise. I normally never bring it up, but the wet hair on the bar of soap spelling out the album's name in just cutesy enough font, it triggered this immediate gut-level revulsion. If it was intended to drive people away, it succeeded way better than they may have wanted. Ugh. So anyway, Stumpwork is easily dry cleaning's best album. It's not close. The sort of legit surprise that completely dodges the sophomore slump, that took a lot of the self-conscious exasperation and muted observations and tries, despite all odds, to find hope, to find change, to find a new direction. A title that simultaneously references embroidery often done for burial caskets and political work, you know, a stump speech, as a band would let their lengthy compositions and much stronger grooves unspool behind Shaw's frustrated workaday observations that echoed much of that first album, but were trying to dream a little more, dream brighter, find fleeting joy in the little things, even if they were juxtaposed with the mundane or outright disgusting, which can often fly counter to the mythologizing of great men or great deeds, especially when Shaw sees them as fewer and far between. The hooks might be subtler, but more textured and better for it, maybe requiring the second or third listen to really stick, worming their way through and taking a far bolder risk than pure disaffection, especially for an ending that sees the sad consequences of ossifying frigidity in England buying into the systems that won't care for you. Not that many critics of the time bothered to go in that deep, unpack what I just did. I saw the word Dadaist thrown around a lot with regards to the seemingly random wordplay that Shaw was using, and I gotta wonder if those critics grasp the layers of using that connotation. A pre yet postmodern art movement that in the face of the Great War in the 1910s sought to create anti-art as a challenge to the worthless society that would expend so much life and material to such pointless suffering in war, where systems and commodification will then rob pure artistry of its meaning, so embrace meaninglessness. Often a cynical and nihilistic movement where Florence Shaw's choice of optimism here might be considered simultaneously bold or heresy, even if the sound behind her would probably be considered too normal to fit within a Dadaist space. Hell, probably some of her writing too. Surrealist maybe, but tilting the line to pure Dadaist non sequiturs? No, not really. But one thing you could not call Stumpwork? Cool. Part of that was pure aesthetics and that album art that turned me off so aggressively. I'm not blaming the more muted reaction and sales of the album sorely on that, but probably didn't help. I mean, I know I wasn't the only one who recoiled and probably just moved past the album, which you could call cowardice. I wouldn't even disagree, even though it actually won a Grammy for its packaging. I don't even know where to begin unpacking that. But part of it was the feeling that by necessity, Stumpwork wasn't as brusque or cutting or disaffected, and there was a lot less easy glamour, more moments that demanded patience from the audience. There was depth for which New Long Leg did not get appreciation at the time, but it felt like the majority weren't even bothering to try to plumb deeper on Stumpwork, where it's way easier to dismiss a lot of the writing as quirky, it doesn't mean anything, just a series of twee jokes or the cultural definition of Dada that just means nonsensical rather than grappling with the politics underneath it. And you know what, that's not surprising either. It seems like once a genre or a sound or a band gets pegged with the Landfill label, be it indie rock or post-punk, it becomes the cheap excuse to assume it's just pretentious. It's not going that hard. It's not trying that hard. Let's not engage in the art. It's not like it's going to chart like their debut did. You don't have to care. You got deadlines to fill. It's not worth another listen or deeper examination, not worth deeper contemplation. It's not like the audience is going to care that much to read into it anyway. What's another post-punk album on the pile? They're all the same, right? We've been hearing it for decades. That sort of assessment, you gotta wonder what it does to the artist. I've talked for years now about how art is the medium of conversation between artist and audience. So what happens when you try to bring forth a more daring assertion, one that might even challenge cultural norms, and it gets broadly overlooked? in a series of shrugs or malaise, where you might have actually veiled your message with some flat disaffection or abstraction, but it was there to be heard if people wanted to listen.
Life, a series of memorials and signals telling us this or that.
You gotta wonder if dry cleaning knew they had to change it up even further. In interviews, they flat out said that they didn't consider themselves just a post-punk band anymore, because Secret Love is a swerve, somewhat, for the band, recorded around the world, and Jeff Tweedy of Wilco showing up to guest on guitar on a couple of songs. It still feels like dry cleaning at its core, post-touring with Nick Cave of all people, because why not double down, make that historical lineage feel all the more entrenched? But they're just feeling out their place and formula after Kate LeBon suggested starting again from scratch. But it's also further breaking from post-punk, embracing more blubbery dub and pop textures, stranger percussion to make their sound a little bit more off-kilter and a jagged adventure. And even then, I wouldn't say it's that much of a break, given the history of post-punk often venturing in very similar directions when they want to change it up, both past and present. It's also sad to say that it's not as good for it, most of which I would chalk up to the production taking Parrish's easy balance and tweaking it in some questionable ways. The gauzy synths and splash of horns are one thing, but Shaw's vocals are increasingly closer to the front of the mix, alongside a lot of male backing punch-ins and singing, and given how much her voice has functioned as both narrative and more of an inner monologue, it feels utterly misguided and unbalanced with the rest of the band. And her faint singing, it does remain the most questionable element in dry cleaning's formula and sound. And the grooves feel even more lumpy and leaden. They only expose how limited the drum work and increasing presence of drum machines actually are. And while I like Tom Dowse's guitars getting a little bit more smoky space and a broader range of textures and tones, this album only seems to accentuate how he's a half step further back, increasingly more beholden to sounds of the past, both in and around rock and post-punk. So yeah, I don't really care for the songs and production as much, and that's a shame. And it happens when you change your sound, I'll admit that. But the lyrics feel more revealing to me, mostly because in the absence of the observational deflection or the strange aspiration for more, an uglier and lonelier depressive darkness is filled in that gap and void, trying to draw forth blood from the stone. It's very revealing across the album how often the protagonist is trying to get secret messages out to the audience that just will not appreciate them, or understand, or possibly even notice they were happening, where right from the opening track, there's this curdled desperation in the self-destructive spiral, or how on Evil, Evil Idiot, the person only wants burned food, but not with any chemicals that might have burned into them that could harm them, yanking back on the choke chain of more reckless self-destruction beyond just idle discomfort. Or across the hidden messages of Cruise Ship Designer, or the most painfully direct meta commentary on that title track. Moreover, it's not the first time where the album references a lot of systems that might control or influence them while these thoughts manifest, but also now the lingering thought whether or not it's really that bad in the end. Oh, you get the impression by the closing track Joy that they're trying to weave the meta text of their more varied creation of this album into some optimistic escape, following off of Stumpwork, building their own little world divorced from the cult, but it doesn't quite feel as earned. And remember my earlier observation, for as much as dry cleaning now want to distance themselves from a lot of that post-punk genre tag and label, there is that awareness of how systems affect and shape our lives. For as much deconstruction as you bring to bear, how much of it is capable of changing things without raw power behind you, where you're all the more acutely aware of how power can be abused or consolidated, so you often wind up disavowing it for your own sake, or it just gets worse. Or it gets co-opted, and you wind up making money, but the message might get lost along the way. I mean, is it cowardice for not calling it bluntly what it is? Or is it just the same as it ever was? same as it ever was. Now, I'm not about to say that Dry Cleaning were making a deliberately self-referential statement on how Stumpwork was being received in 2022, or that this new album feels like a stark reflection of what happens when a band gets elevated based on a lot of nebulous coolness and proximity to historical power for a time, and they wind up more lonely and frustrated as a result. But Stumpwork came out in late 2022. It's now 3.5 years later. There's certainly evidence that a more song-focused approach might have led to a bit of a troubled production. You never know, swapping out new producers, especially bringing in an acclaimed indie producer to shake up the sound, tell him to junk the album and start over, with a more pronounced, darker tone turn inwards to the point where a gesture towards joy feels increasingly hollow. And there is also something so backhanded in how an album that critics once put on a pedestal just 5 years ago are now tossed aside amongst landfill post-punk as an indicator of an oversaturated scene with nothing to say but held up as emblematic rock. You know what? No, a music establishment that won't innovate enough, as if they might be, scared or something. So let's talk about that other word we've conspicuously ignored in all of this. Landfill. The dump. Trash. An expanse of land used to discard waste, to be burned, left forgotten amidst all the refuse. Your garbage goes there, as does a lot of your recycling, because it's much easier to guilt people within the systems to do their part and recycle for environmental change instead of seriously target the fossil fuel conglomerates to be broken up who are destroying the planet. But also, recycling is hard behind the scenes, requires work the majority of individuals just won't do, so a lot of presumed recycling winds up at the garbage dump. You probably knew that already. You don't like thinking about it. If you didn't know, you're probably a little irked that I brought it up. And while I won't claim to get into Andrew Harrison's head when he coined the term landfill indie, the implication was clear at the time. You might like landfill indie for a time, a moment, maybe a summer, but by the end of the day, those albums, those singles, that merch, those artists are gonna wind up in a landfill. And it's an open question what goes first: the unsold plastic, vinyl, clothing, and decals, or something that was sold and then tossed away, as disposable as the art was perceived to be. You'd like to think that that's not the case, that people will cling to the art that gives them something and an instance of joy, but the music industry knows that in the race to the bottom, there's always going to be refuse that's created in the wake. They just want to cash in before it winds up inevitably there. After all, it's not like the consumers or writers are doing their best work, valuing acts that are making it in the first place. And Dry Cleaning probably knows all of this. Bands read the press, they read the discourse around themselves, especially in the 2020s. They probably heard the label landfill post-punk. And just because some of their lyrics might seem abstracted or nonsensical doesn't mean they're not aware of the power of words, and almost certainly the systems that are underpinning them, allowing the words to be spoken. They know landfill post-punk implies not just derivative hollowness, but interchangeability, that the market is saturated. Everybody's trying to get a piece of the bubble before it pops or fades away. It's why they're trying to differentiate themselves as not just post-punk, and they're trying to do it as fast as they can, even if it's led to their commercial decline as they struggle to recapture the narrative. I mean, it leads to a very bleak truism that in trying to make art, to differentiate themselves from the pack, think bigger, go bigger, find their unkempt earnestness beyond that all that deflection, they lost the fickle attention of a lot of critics, chasing the next best thing, who never bothered to dig deeper because that would be the furthest thing from cool in both the art they seek, the criticism they write, and themselves. Dry Cleaning tried to write their way out. Few people cared. But you know what? Can you blame the critics? Those overwhelmed by more recorded music coming out than ever before, the request to review all of it, when there's more traffic and a pithy turn of phrase and a clickbait headline than actual analysis or introspection. Those who on the same day as Stumpwork was released, they saw the album art And then they looked at all the other albums that came out that day. You know, Arctic Monkeys, Carly Rae Jepsen, Tegan and Sarah, Young Boy Never Broke Again. And you know what? This little known pop artist, you may have heard of her. Her name is Taylor Swift, and she put out Midnights and then said, you know what? Dry cleaning, they can wait. Then they ran out of time getting back around to the album before the end of the year. And given that Stumpwork never got that much in the way of critical acclaim outside of limited outlets, those other critics probably never got back to it. I mean, I did even less than that. I never brought up the band in the first place at the time, and there's a part of me that wishes I gave dry cleaning more of a chance in their time instead of only making content about their latest and weakest album. In the context of a genre label they are trying desperately to escape. A genre label emblematic of capitalistic excess and waste, where a band and their art trying to deconstruct that system winds up getting crushed within that system's meat grinder. A label that's not only dismissive, unthinking, but driven off of the pure hubris that a saturated scene has nothing to say about the world. And even if they did, it's not going to change that world. Why would anyone bother caring? But here's the pitch black reality. All the art you've purchased, all the records, all the CDs you buy, all the merch you picked up at a festival, it all winds up in the landfill eventually, someday. The garbage truck does not differentiate on Rate Your Music or Metacritic or Billboard charts. You get older, the world gets colder. You question whether or not you really need it if you're moving, and you realize it's more effort than worth to sell it all on Facebook Marketplace or Discogs, presuming there's a market at all, so you leave it by the side of the road. Or you might sell it back to a local record store. You hope somebody might buy it, but if it doesn't move, the used copies wind up at the back of every single record store before eventually getting dumped when they need more space for more product. Or you die, and your relatives have to sift through your collections, what you've left behind. And do you honestly think they're gonna care that much about the art that resonated the most with you to actually try and pass it on, dig more into it, preserve it, presuming they even want to play it at all, or that they can play it beyond the newest retro craze? Don't think this can't happen. Vinyl, CDs, they've had waves of falling in and out of style. I have literally inherited Edison records from multiple generations ago that I physically cannot play because I don't own a phonograph with the right needle in order to play them. The merciless reality of the march of technology, where not even preservation or digitization will ensure that it's safe, because both would require enough people to care to do it. Be it classics of the past, or landfill indie, or landfill post-punk. There's a deep pit waiting for all of it. And if you think that all that's a tragic waste of art that you think matters, maybe that should say something about how we reflect on art, how we talk about it, the people who make it, the systems that should be serving people and not served by people. I mean, dry cleaning knew that. I was prepared to call a landfill post-punk act cowards for hiding behind postmodern artifice in the face of a world that is speeding towards man's self-inflicted reckoning. But the rotten truth is that dry cleaning said it more brazenly than many, and so few deign to listen, nor care, nor change. It shows that when some would rather toss ideas away rather than grapple with them, put in the hard work, embrace slop instead. Yes, that shows you who the cowards really are. You know, I think the shirt might actually be dry clean only. You think it could risk going through the wash? I mean, I could always get another, right?